Everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with, I would say, a much more personal video. And I usually don't have my videos be about myself or really talk about myself, but I know first and foremost a goal I always have of talking about books on this channel is a way that I feel like I can help empower people with information to where they might be able to learn from different perspectives and just educate themselves about what types of books they would like to read. And recently, with how the world has been lately, especially when I first heard about the woman, I think it was in Central Park, where she called 911 on this African American man, and she changes the tone of her voice to sound like she's in danger when she isn't. And then, of course, everyone talking about, if you haven't heard, about George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Right now, there are a lot of protests going on. And what this really made me all think of is, other than being obviously disappointed with how upsetting all of this is, the first thing I want to note is that none of this is isolated, of course, that the violence against people of color or the discrimination or the racism against them, and me being a person of color myself, I started thinking of what can I do, or what can I maybe feel like, even if it's the littlest thing I can do, sort of what I can do to help maybe educate people. And so for today, what I want to do, just speaking for myself, I am a person of color, so I thought I could present some books to you all in case you would like to hear from stories, since these are all nonfiction books from people of color. Obviously, I have some disclaimers with a video like this, but obviously, I'm not like the authority on being a person of color for every person of color in the world. And I'm also certainly not trying to say that by reading that you're creating reading as a substitute for how you interact with people of color in your real life. But the books I'm talking about today have definitely been ones that really shaped me or made me think about these sort of unconscious things that I never knew quite how to find ways to relate to growing up about being a person of color, that I found answers for in these books. And the first book I wanted to bring up was Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong. I updated on my reading progress with this book in my last video, but I've since finished it, and I know that I mentioned that it felt like I was reading an annotated bibliography, or basically a whole book about these different citations of how Asian Americans or just Asian people have been feeling, with microaggressions specifically targeted towards them. And I'm happy to report that since finishing the book, I liked it a lot more, just because I felt like Hong was getting into territory where, towards the end, there's this really long personal essay about her experience in college and the friends that she had there through her own sense of storytelling. But otherwise, sometimes her claims in this book feel a bit offhanded or not explained as thoroughly as I would have liked. But this is still a great entry point into anyone wondering about sort of a nice collective way, especially thinking of how or what the Asian American experience feels like. The next book I wanted to talk about was Trick Mirror by Tolentino. And really with this one, I think it's probably the most like loose as a part of this list. But the reason I want to include it here and how it kind of affected me is first knowing that Tolentino is also Filipino, so shout out to that. But really what it was for me is that Tolentino, she, I think, has really crafted her sense of being so observant as a journalist by this one specific essay being sort of the epicenter of everything. And it was an essay about how, as she's growing up in Texas, she tried going to church, and she really liked the idea of what church was doing for people, about this idea of grace and forgiveness and reaching this sense of a higher place. But to me, I read that as a way of her confronting unconsciously being younger and getting used to what it's like navigating yourself as a person of color by finding spaces like churches as a way to sort of have that assimilation. There aren't really any overt sort of discussions of race that Tolentino gives in her essays, but to me, I see it clear as day that, especially one essay about the optimization of beauty and, of course, the internet, because that's what this whole book is about pretty much, that Tolentino's ideas, the way she's so observant, is because that's what I really think being a person of color does to you. It requires you to be vigilant and to assess sort of the conscious and unconscious ways of assimilating that information about what it means to be othered or to feel different than from your peers. With Gia Tolentino growing up in Texas, and then me thinking of myself growing up in a very white area in West Virginia, where literally in my years of public school, there was only a handful of people of color in my class, and pretty much the whole school, including myself and my sister. It's really hard to explain, but with this book, I felt like I got that same sense of process that I felt like I could relate to Gia Tolentino in that way too. This next one I would consider like a staple for a lot of people, and that's Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. I haven't read The Fire Next Time by him yet, but I know that's also a staple for people to understand more about people of color in general. I would describe this book more as it felt like reading these loose diary entries, or at least my context of it was how I kind of shaped how Baldwin describes his personal experiences with race, and also at a time living in Paris, and how that's like pretty much the entirety of Giovanni's Room as well, which I'd read right before reading Notes of a Native Son. But yeah, Baldwin has always been a public person of discussing race, and eventually I know kind of Baldwin was the one that inspired Ta-Nehisi Coates as well to write Between the World and Me, which I also really liked, and is also a great book if you're considering reading books by people of color. I'd also like to bring up How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. Jones's memoir is essentially him giving a very linear take on his life. This is the first work I've read by Jones, and he does such a great job at giving this description of emotion happening simultaneously to these very gripping events just happening in real time as well. And a lot of this comes from how Jones is thinking back on his life and talking about these prime moments where he realized that he is a gay black man. A part of that too is that he brings up this very honest point about he's coming out to his mother over the phone, and he realized that a part of that experience is that he assumed the biggest obstacle in his life would be coming out, but he never felt like he was coming out as himself because he was still processing what it meant to be gay, but also a gay black man. Jones dives into this further by talking about these sexual adventures with men, primarily white men, and how they fetishize him for being black. There's this really specific scene where Jones is talking about constantly finding mirrors to look at, or not even look at, but just being very aware that mirrors are around him to where he can see his own reflection, and how he still feels confused by himself. And these moments where he's describing moments like this feels very raw, and kind of reminds me of like really me not understanding my own perception of what it means to be a person of color in such a white space, or to be perceived by white people, because I never really had that sort of confrontation at all in my upbringing. I'll be the first to admit that I would definitely consider myself to be very whitewashed just because of the environment I was growing up in, and my father is also white. So a part of that too with more books that I'm mentioning is whenever I read Too Much and Not the Mood by Durga Chew-Bose, I really liked this essay collection. She describes what it feels like to have immigrant parents, and that relationship between being understanding this isn't the right word, but the suffering of your parents, and what it means to live by their example and to sort of live beyond them by adopting their own burdens. This comparison is most evident whenever Chew-Bose has an essay talking about how her name, Durga, is actually followed down through her family line, because all of the women in her family were named beginning with the letter D. And she starts talking about how in one essay she uses these older white girls as an example of something that feels simultaneously far-reaching. And for her it's a bit different because she's much older when she actually moves to the States with her parents. And I think for Chew-Bose, her identity of also using New York City as the landscape of where she's describing where she felt like she was becoming the most formative and really getting to know herself better, I think it all boils down to, for her at least, understanding her relationship with people like her mom and what it means to be a woman of color. So I really liked this essay collection. And speaking of immigrant parents, I wanted to talk about The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui. This is a graphic memoir where Bui talks about how her family is escaping from the Vietnam War, and she moves to the Midwest and then eventually to California. I feel like anyone that has an immigrant parent could relate to this memoir, but I immediately thought of so many times of my mom, and I don't really know, truthfully, a lot about my mom's history with immigrating here to the US. And what I really liked about this memoir is just how masterfully that Bui is able to convey these emotions in her own parents' history and really honoring that. But still, even Bui is able to remember and process how the frenzy of this period of her life, she can amount it to giving it nicknames like the refugee reflex. And in these moments of peril, she understands how she can look back on it when she's older, whenever she herself becomes a mother, which makes her think of her own mom, and how it's really this nice ending or this nice scene that Bui talks about how she's saving up all of these coins throughout the year, and she thinks it all amounts to $100. And of course, it doesn't add up to $100, but she's still, the point of it being that her gesture is to give that money to her mother and always feel like that she's in debt to her. And there's really that sort of displacement of good intentions, but also this like bad, like emotional turmoil. And I definitely relate to that with my mom. Whenever I was growing up, she would always compare her life in the Philippines and then how she would watch me and my siblings having the privilege to grow up in America. And I was too young to understand it, but my mom was always compassionate and empathetic, certainly, but she was always scared for us, and she definitely, I would say, wanted us to be whitewashed so we would be okay. But as she got older, she kind of had conflicting feelings and in ways felt a bit more cheated, or maybe, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but anyone knowing what it's like to have immigrant parents, I think you would understand too by reading this book. And the last book I have here is How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee. Out of this list, I would definitely say this is one most focused on writing, but I did think Chee's insights to like academia and what obviously that would do to his own writing, and really what it's meant to be, it leading all up to how Chee explains his own sexual assault. And what I like about this book, or these essays, and really everything I'm talking about for this video today, is that while these books don't, like, you know, point blank talk about race to you, they always introduce these people's lives first, and then it makes you think about how race, among many other things, is only this one factor, but it is a big factor. And in one of the essays, Chee talks about how one of his writing instructors says to him, "You could be the first gay Korean American author." And then Chee responds, "I was by now used to people being surprised by me and my background, and their surprise offended me. I was always having to be what I was looking for in the world, wishing that the person I would become already existed, some other I before me. I was forever finding even the tiniest way to identify with someone, to escape how empty the world seemed to be of what I was. I was still discovering that this identity, any identity really, was unreliable precisely because it was self-made. When people told me to write about my family, it felt like I was being told that my imagination wasn't good enough." And I wanted to end all of this with that quote because, again, with all of these being nonfiction books, there is that looming idea of what it means to be a writer in our world and the responsibilities of that, which led me to thinking of all of that, to think of making this video and kind of what I can do with my own sense of responsibility or my own platform with having this booktube channel, and maybe giving these book suggestions in case you're curious about what you can do by reading more authors that are people of color. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.